My name is Sandra Liebenberg, and I am Professor of Human Rights Law at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to this side event, to the 60th session of the Commission on Social Development. This side event is co-organized by ATD Fourth World, by the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, supporting special procedures, and then also by the NGO Committee on Social Development. The title of today's event is Dignity for All in Practice: Overcoming Poverty-Based Discrimination. Now, this title resonates very well with the overall theme of the Commission session, which is inclusive and resilient recovery from COVID-19 for sustainable livelihoods, well-being and dignity for all, eradicating poverty and hunger in all its forms and dimensions to achieve the 2030 agenda. The theme of today's side event invites us to reflect on the implications of viewing poverty through the lens of equality and non-discrimination. And I think this is a very important lens because it invites us to broaden our understanding of poverty beyond simply money metric measures of poverty or even deprivation of basic social needs understandings. And it asks us to think of poverty, of how it is constructed by a combination of laws, policies, and institutional practices that collectively exclude the poor from full participation in political, economic, social, and cultural life. In so doing, it marginalizes their voices and undermines their human dignity. So the purpose of this webinar then is to explore in greater depth what it means to view poverty through a non-discrimination lens. And in pursuit of this objective, our panelists will address three main themes. Firstly, the why question. Why prohibit poverty on the grounds of socioeconomic disadvantage? Secondly, what are the implications of prohibiting poverty on the grounds of socioeconomic disadvantage? And then the third set of questions looks at country-level experiences with prohibiting poverty on the grounds of socioeconomic disadvantage or poverty. So we are very fortunate today to have a set of wonderful panelists from diverse backgrounds and spheres to address these three questions. I will briefly introduce each of them in turn when I call upon them to make their interventions. And following the interventions, we will then transition to what I hope will be a very dynamic, interactive question and answer session. And on behalf of the organizers, I invite you to post your questions in the chat and we'll pick them up in the Q&A session and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So I turn now to our first formal presentation on the question of why prohibit discrimination on the grounds of poverty. And it is very fitting that we have two grassroots community activists from ATD Fourth World to address this fundamental question. So I want to inquire first is whether we have Mr. Guba Wasiani from Burkina Faso, if he has managed to join us. I know there were some problems with internet, so if the organizers could just let me know if he is with us.
He hasn't joined yet, Sandy, so we can go to Andrew.
Okay, so hopefully he will join us then in the course of the webinar. I think this would be a very important voice to hear from Africa, from the African continent, and it would be very good if we can slot in later. So I then want to call on Andrew Kelly, who is a community activist and I believe a poet also from ATD Fourth World in Dublin, Ireland. Andrew, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. I'm Andrew from ATD Ireland, and I'd just like to thank you for this opportunity to address this room full of people who can and do make a difference. I am here today as a community activist from ATD Ireland because I believe change is possible. I really want a better world and a more just society for my kids. Without such poverty and open socioeconomic discrimination that I have faced my whole life. Only by working together can we break the intergenerational cycle of poverty. As we all know, the last 22 months was a difficult time for many people, particularly those who had felt excluded and were dealing with persistent struggles and worries, even before this pandemic. They felt more than ever left behind. I want to briefly mention an important project that helped me to be here today and supported me to express myself and step up. One of our projects in Ireland during the lockdown was to create an online writing group where people could share writing, hopes, aspirations. I'm after losing track. It restored hope for people to be able to express themselves in a creative way through writing. We were liberated from isolation. A prison can often be 6 inches from here to here, a prison of the mind. This creative expression was a distraction from poverty. There's a reason I use the word distraction. It's that poverty is consistent, and the writing set us free from our prison of the mind. One of the examples of poetry is this. It was by Paul Uzell. It's called Transparent, and it reads, "Your constant mocking echoes again and again. If only silence, let peace begin. Eradicate your torment with a swipe of my pen. A little trick learned while confined to a cell. How the beauty in a poem can free one from hell." This lockdown project supported me to be here today and speak out. Finding the strength and confidence to speak out is essential and an early step in any real partnership for creating change. This should not be overlooked. Genuine participation and building trustful partnerships is key. For too long, we have not had a genuine seat at the tables of power. When I say genuine, I am referring to having our voices, ideas, and aspirations heard, listened to, and acted upon. But people with direct experience of poverty should be recognized as experts on poverty and should be included in any societal debate. We need to change the tables to be more accessible. This participation is essential, but it takes time and effort to build up the confidence to speak out. Trust me, I know. What does it mean to live in poverty? Poverty is not being able to smell the flowers because the stress of life gets in the way. This simple sentence makes us very aware of many of the issues facing people living in poverty. Poverty is a multi-dimensional issue, a lot more complex than only financial. We are facing multiple challenges simultaneously. When I was young, I was written off by many due to my situation. But now I've defied all the odds. Now I have the skills and experience because of the struggles I went through. All too often, people's skills are not recognized and even ignored. This is prejudice and discrimination. It results in people in poverty feeling like they are treated like lesser human beings. Discrimination is part of poverty experience and should be addressed. When you live in poverty and you experience socioeconomic discrimination, you don't have any real protection. Even though in Ireland we have already 9 discrimination grounds in equality legislation, we are not protected. We constantly fall through the cracks. One of our main campaigns in Ireland is to ask for socioeconomic discrimination to be brought into equality legislation. Things can't move forward until we bring the socioeconomic status as a 10th ground. I'm proud to be a part of this campaign, and I have recently spoken to Irish ministers about socioeconomic discrimination to build up awareness of the need of a 10th ground in equality legislation. I would just like to share 2 short examples from Ireland. And this is about my wife. When my wife was in hospital giving birth to her first child, the first person to visit her was a social worker. And this was only because we had a history of addiction. The social worker came down on us pretty hard, and this really made my wife afraid that our baby would be taken away by the social worker. In the end, the social worker visited our home and everything was fine. But should this be a way you bring your first child into this world with fear and discrimination? And the next example is Gavin, so he's going to read that out.
Hello, everybody. I'll introduce. My name is Gavin Uzell. I'm a social activist with ATD for the past 7 years, and I'm a co-founder alongside Andrew with the UCYG Unity in the Community Youth Group, and I was a participant in the Lockdown Liberties, and my part is on poverty in social economic discrimination. So I'm going to read a brief. A single parent can be struggling day in and day out on very little income. This can arrive on a Thursday. By Monday, it's gone. Gone on gas, baby products, food, washing, household stuff, leave cards, clothes, etc. The basics, not luxury items. You can feel discriminated against because you are a young parent struggling. You can feel dominated by the system, and you can feel that you can't stand up to the system, to it, feeling lower down the pecking order than others who are better off. And society views people very different to us, to who are struggling. This can and does lead to discrimination. The consequences can be very damaging, leading to low confidence, lack of self-worth, depression, poor health, stigma, guilt. This can have a negative effect on the child, and that child could be open to bullying at school and feel less important than others. The judgments hurt, the same hurts. It takes so much strength for that parent to not break down. This is the cycle of poverty, Gavin. And thank you for letting me have this opportunity to give me part.
Now, we have many real more life examples in Does It Only Happen to Me? Report on Socioeconomic Discrimination that brought over 100 people together to share examples of discrimination. I just wanted to highlight the massive link between discrimination against shouldering shame and stigma and the effect on mental health. It really hurts to the point, It really hurts to the point where it can give you a mental health disorder. We need to act now. Can you imagine Ireland or even the world where people that do experience socioeconomic discrimination being able to access employment be able to access goods and other services without having this fear and shame. I would love to see it happen in my lifetime, so my kids can grow up without this fear. This would address the deep impact and the loss of dignity that discrimination brings, leading to more happy and content lives. And it would decrease the amount of people that suffer from a mental strain. It just doesn't make sense to me to not have a think around the inequality legislation and protection within the law. So in conclusion, I would like to stress that we really need to act together for change with no one left behind and make us feel proud again of the UN and what the UN can stand for. So I just want to thank you for listening and thank you for this experience. I just want to say one thing. When I said earlier on that many people had written me off, I was one of them. I would have never imagined myself speaking out in an event as important as this. So we are here and willing partners. So thanks very much.
Well done. Well done. It's a pleasure.
Thanks very much, Andrew and Gavin, for sharing that very moving both poetry and direct testimony of the experiences of poverty. I think you have really sketched for us extremely well what the lived reality and multi-dimensional facets are. So thank you very much. And then I'm delighted that Mr. Guba Wasiani has been able to join us, and I'm going to call on him next to address the topic of why poverty as a ground of discrimination. He is also a community activist from Burkina Faso and part of the ATD Fourth World National Team. So, Mr. Wasiani, the floor is yours, please.
Voilà, merci beaucoup de m'avoir donné la parole. Je m'appelle Gouba Ousseini, militant d'ATD Quart-Monde au Burkina Faso. Mettre les personnes de côté, ça blesse les personnes. Ça les empêche d'avancer. Ce n'est pas parce que tu es pauvre que tu n'as pas de droits, que tu n'as pas de valeur. Toute personne a une valeur qu'on doit respecter. Quel qu'en soit ce qu'il fait, quel qu'en soit ce qu'il est. Parfois, je veux prendre l'exemple survécu. On voulait aider un enfant à faire son acte de naissance. On avait l'autorisation pour aider les enfants à faire leur acte de naissance. Le ministère des droits civils a réparti les mairies. La mairie laquelle on était orienté, quand on est arrivé, on a présenté le document de l'enfant. Sans à la présidente des jurys de la mairie, elle n'a même pas nous écouté. Elle nous a dit qu'on ne pouvait pas faire le document de l'enfant. En tant qu'accompagnant, cela m'a fait mal. L'enfant était frustré. Les enfants, les jeunes qui travaillent, qui vivent dans la rue, sont confrontés de cette situation. Chaque jour, nous qui les accompagnons, souvent, ça touche notre dignité. On avait une militante qui était malade, qui était à l'hôpital. Dans la salle dans laquelle elle était, elle avait besoin de l'oxygène. Dans la salle dans laquelle elle était, il n'y avait pas l'oxygène. C'est quand on est allé pour la rendre visite qu'on a vu l'état qu'elle était. On était obligé d'aller parler au médecin pour qu'il vienne avec un siège roulant. C'est moi-même qui l'ai poussée pour la faire descendre en bas. Elle était au premier étage pour la mettre dans une salle l'oxygène. De là-bas, elle avait besoin de sang. On a mobilisé, on a demandé aux étudiants. Il y a des gens qui sont venus donner leur sang. Et les sang qu'ils ont donné à son nom n'est pas arrivé. C'est ça, un ami qui dit, quand tu es pauvre, quand tu n'as pas d'amis, tu peux mourir sans arriver ton jour. La dignité, moi, je vis ma dignité en respectant tout le monde. Quelqu'un qui est conscient de sa dignité, il est prêt d'aller vers les autres. Il est prêt d'aller partager son savoir avec les autres. Pour terminer, pour dire Anti-Discrimination Monde lutte pour le respect et les droits de ceux qui vivent la pauvreté. Pour les faire savoir qu'ils ont la chance, comme tous les autres. Ouais, je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Gopa, for that incredibly moving presentation. I think you have really brought home to us how poverty undermines dignity, how government officials treat one as second-class citizens because one is poor. And then also in the stories and the cases you shared with us, how literally it can be a life and death matter. So I thank you very much for sharing and for having the courage to share that testimony with us today. And I think it provides both testimonies from Andrew and from yourself, provides us with a very important grounding as we transition then to the next question, which asks what are the implications of treating poverty as a ground of discrimination. And we are very fortunate to have Olivier de Schutter, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty. He is also a professor on human rights law at UC Leuven and Sciences Po, and an extremely well-known scholar, academic, activist indeed, who I've had the great privilege of working with also on the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So Olivier, the floor is yours.
Many thanks indeed, Sandy, and very warm welcome to everyone on this important discussion. In his submission to the Commission for Social Development, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres mentions the following. He writes in his report to the Commission, understanding poverty and finding solutions to eradicate it must rest on an approach based on the dignity and respect of the person and their rights. Dignity implies, inter alia, non-discrimination on any grounds. I think this is an important recognition that the fight against discrimination is essential to break the cycles that perpetuate poverty. Discrimination is not only a violation of human rights, it's also a considerable cost to society as a whole. It leads people to reduce their investments in human capital, in acquiring qualifications, in being trained, in seeking to improve their qualifications. It lowers confidence. It leads to professional segregation due to the lack of role models, as too few people have crossed social barriers, and it leads to low aspirations, both of parents and of adolescents and young adults. This is why the 2012 Guiding Principles on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, approved by the Human Rights Council, mentions that people with the experience of poverty live in a vicious cycle of powerlessness, stigmatization, discrimination, exclusion, and material deprivation, which all mutually reinforce one another. So implementing the promise made in Article 2, Paragraph 2 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which prohibits discrimination on grounds of social origin and property, translated into Spanish as posición económica, showing that the intention was really to challenge class-based discrimination. That promise is extremely important to keep, at least if it is not understood narrowly and naively as promoting meritocracy. As we all know, merit is often ignoring the disadvantages that people in poverty have faced in early childhood and later. And I believe myself that real equality of opportunities requires much more to be done if we focus only on merit. We will not allow people to have real chances in life. We need to provide families with decent housing, adequate nutrition, healthcare, strong social protection, robust minimum wage legislation, in the absence of which this idea that merit should determine access to social goods will be meaningless for people coming from a low income background. Now, what does it mean to combat discrimination on grounds of poverty? What does it mean to go beyond a naive meritocratic-based interpretation of this requirement? In my view, it means three things. First, it means we need to address not only direct discrimination on grounds of socioeconomic disadvantage, but also indirect discrimination. Direct discrimination means, for example, that we should not allow landlords to refuse to lease an apartment to a person living on social aid. We should not allow a bank to refuse a person to open an account because the person has no sufficient or regular income. We should not allow school officials to remain passive when pupils are being bullied by their classmates because they come from low-income families. But we also must combat indirect discrimination. For example, when employers do not hire a job applicant residing in a certain neighborhood, or does not accept as interns, as trainees, people coming from schools that have a reputation for disproportionately being populated by children from low social economic background. And so discrimination, properly understood, should include not only direct instances where low incomes are the basis for a decision being made about a person, but also indirect discrimination, where people in poverty disproportionately are affected by certain policies, processes that are neutral on their face. Secondly, it means seeking individualized solutions to accommodate the specific circumstances of people with experience of poverty. In recruitment processes today, we see a shift currently from the focus on diplomas and formal qualifications to other so-called social and soft skills, for example, good communication skills. And this may be a problem for people in poverty because, of course, it gives great importance to the role of social networks, which very often they don't manage to mobilize. It gives great importance to cultural capital, which they have no access to. But that shift away from diplomas and formal qualifications can also be an asset, an opportunity, forcing employers to reflect about their practices and identify how people in poverty can actually enrich the understanding of certain issues, bringing a new perspective to the table when a company makes a decision. That is what reasonable accommodation is all about. It's about adapting the institution, the definition of the task, the working environment, the learning environment, etc., to the specific characteristics of the individual concerned. This means moving from societies that see social exclusion as an inevitable price to pay for competitiveness to inclusive societies that value and cherish diversity. Thirdly, and finally, to understand discrimination, how important it is to combat discrimination against poverty, we need to understand discrimination as requiring affirmative action policies to be adopted in order to overcome the systemic nature of discrimination faced by people in poverty. People in poverty are not only discriminated against in employment, or in access to healthcare, or in access to education, or in access to housing. They are discriminated against in all areas of life. So that, for example, even if you remove discriminatory practices against people in poverty in employment, if they don't have access to the right schools, if they live far away from where employment opportunities exist and are discriminated in access to certain neighborhoods, they still will not be able to have access to decent employment. They still will be deprived from having the opportunity to earn decent livelihoods. And therefore, we need affirmative action policies to be implemented in order to address this systemic discrimination. That is a way to improve inclusion, of course, of people in poverty in certain areas of life. It's also a way to break down stereotypes. We have many studies that show that interaction with persons in poverty reduces the stereotypes that people entertain against them and can increase, therefore, social tolerance. We have, for example, very interesting studies from schools in Delhi that were forced by judicial order to accept children from low-income families, forcing these elite schools to become more diversified in their composition and leading, in turn, rich pupils to become much more understanding of the situation of poor pupils or pupils from low castes. And finally, affirmative action is a way to increase confidence by providing role models to people in poverty that can seek inspiration from those who have succeeded thanks to those affirmative action policies. And it's a way to overcome the aspirations gap, the lowered expectations that parents and adolescents sometimes have about future adult lives. And so for all these reasons, I think it's important to combat discrimination on grounds of poverty, but to use discrimination in the full sense of the expression, with all these consequences that should be included in the prohibition of discrimination on grounds of socioeconomic disadvantage. Many thanks.
Thanks very much, Olivia. I think you have given us a very clear picture of the fact that not only is recognizing poverty as a prohibited ground of discrimination already part of international law through the International Covenant and indeed regional instruments such as the African Charter, which has wealth as a prohibited ground of discrimination, which could include poverty as well, but also setting out for us very clearly the tools that we have available in discrimination law to tackle many of these concrete examples you gave us of discrimination on the grounds of poverty. So now we transition through to the last set of questions, which looks at some concrete country studies. And we have studies from France and then from Chile. And I'm going to call then on Professor Diane Romain, who is Professor of Public Law and Jurist at Sorbonne University in France, to please make her presentation to us on the experience in France. You have the floor, Diane.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Il y a presque 6 ans, le Parlement français a adopté la loi 2016-832 en juin 2016, donc, qui visait à lutter contre la discrimination à raison de la précarité sociale. Et cette loi a introduit un nouveau critère de discrimination qui est fondé sur, je cite, la particulière vulnérabilité résultant de la situation économique de la personne. Alors, c'est un intitulé qui est un peu compliqué, mais le but du législateur français était bien d'interdire les discriminations fondées sur la pauvreté. Et cette disposition a été intégrée au Code pénal, au Code du travail et à une loi cadre de lutte contre les discriminations. Cette loi de 2016 n'était pas tout à fait une nouveauté, puisqu'il y avait en droit français déjà d'autres dispositions. Par exemple, en matière de santé, le fait de refuser des soins à une personne lorsqu'elle est bénéficiaire d'aide sociale, eh bien, c'était déjà interdit depuis 2009. Et puis, de même, en matière pénale, l'abus de vulnérabilité est incriminé pour protéger les personnes contre les risques d'exploitation au travail ou par le logement. Donc, à première vue, le droit français offre un catalogue général de mesures qui visent à protéger les personnes vulnérables en raison de leur pauvreté. Mais un peu plus de 5 ans après l'entrée en vigueur de cette loi, il faut convenir que le bilan est assez mitigé et cette loi présente 2 difficultés sur lesquelles je voudrais insister. La première difficulté, elle est d'ordre théorique. La loi de 2016 ne prétendait pas être une loi de lutte contre la pauvreté, mais bien une loi de lutte contre les discriminations fondées sur la pauvreté. Et évidemment, ce n'est pas la même chose. Ce n'est pas la même chose parce que la lutte contre la pauvreté nécessite une mise en œuvre pérenne des droits sociaux qui sont garantis par la Constitution et également par le pacte international sur les droits économiques, sociaux et culturels, le pacte des Nations Unies de 1966. Et de l'autre côté, l'interdiction de la discrimination fondée sur la pauvreté n'est pas un outil majeur de transformation politique et sociale. Il s'agit, et c'est important, de lutter contre certains comportements, contre certaines décisions qui ont pour effet de stigmatiser et d'exclure les personnes. Donc, c'est un outil supplémentaire, mais ce n'est pas un outil suffisant pour garantir la justice sociale et l'accent doit être mis aussi sur le respect des droits sociaux. La deuxième difficulté que présente la loi de 2016, la loi française, elle est d'ordre pratique. Ce que l'on constate, c'est que plus de 5 ans après avoir introduit parmi les motifs de discrimination prohibés le critère de vulnérabilité économique, eh bien, cela reste très peu mobilisé par les victimes. Pour vous donner un exemple, en 2019, cela constituait moins de 2% des réclamations adressées au défenseur des droits, qui est l'ombudsman français chargé de la lutte contre les discriminations. Donc, il y a peu de saisines du défenseur des droits et par ailleurs, il n'y a aucun contentieux devant les tribunaux qui a abouti. Les tribunaux français n'ont jamais rendu de décision reconnaissant une discrimination fondée sur la vulnérabilité économique. Alors, pourtant, évidemment, théoriquement, les exemples ne manquent pas. La discrimination fondée sur la pauvreté, ça peut être par exemple le fait de refuser de louer un logement à une personne qui dispose de revenus suffisants grâce aux aides sociales, mais justement parce qu'elle perçoit des aides sociales. Ça peut être le fait de refuser des enfants à la cantine scolaire quand leurs parents sont au chômage. Ça peut être le fait de refuser des soins à un malade au motif qu'il dépend de l'aide sociale. Ou ça peut être encore le fait de licencier une mère de famille célibataire au motif que ses charges familiales ne lui permettent pas d'accepter des modifications dans ses horaires de travail. Eh bien, aucune de ces situations n'a donné lieu à ce jour à un contentieux, à une décision de justice sur le fondement de la loi de 2016. Évidemment, il y a plusieurs façons d'interpréter cette faible implémentation de la loi. La première, évidemment, on l'écarte, c'est celle qui consiste à dire que s'il n'y a pas de plainte, s'il n'y a pas de condamnation, c'est parce qu'il n'y a pas de problème de discrimination. Évidemment, c'est une explication qui ne tient pas la route. Et il faut plutôt se tourner vers d'autres explications. Certainement, cette loi est peu connue et elle est surtout peu connue des personnes vulnérables socialement, économiquement, qui évidemment n'ont pas les ressources culturelles, sociales suffisantes pour agir en justice et saisir les tribunaux. Et puis, une dernière explication à cette faible mise en œuvre de la loi, ça peut être la difficulté à établir la preuve de la discrimination. Donc, tout ça pour conclure, et en résumé, l'exemple français me paraît tout à fait révélateur. Interdire la discrimination fondée sur la pauvreté, c'est un symbole politique fort. Ça permet d'affirmer l'égale dignité de toute personne, quels que soient ses revenus, quel que soit son statut social. C'est un symbole politique fort, mais ce n'est pas une mesure suffisante. Et cette mesure doit s'accompagner d'une politique résolue de mise en œuvre des droits économiques, de mise en œuvre des droits sociaux dans tous les domaines, l'emploi, l'enfance, la santé, la justice, l'éducation. Et surtout, cela doit s'accompagner d'une forte mobilisation pour garantir l'accès effectif à ces droits. Voilà ce que l'on peut dire avec quelques années de recul de l'exemple français. Je vous remercie pour votre attention et je vous redonne la parole, Madame la Présidente.
Thanks very much, Dion, for that. Those very interesting reflections on the French experience, and I think for highlighting for us, you know, the symbolic importance of the law in France, but then also the challenges of remedies and implementation. And I think in the South African context, this is very similar to what we face, and it's indeed something I hope we can pick up on in the question and answer. So our last panelist, we're very honored to have Ambassador Frank Tresler from the Permanent Mission of Chile to the United Nations to speak to us on the Chilean experience. So Your Excellency, Ambassador Tresler, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm very glad to be part of this, we can say, global panel. I've seen we have people from all around the world. I'm very grateful for the invitation to participate in this event and to share some reflections and experiences from Chile on our public policy to address discrimination based on poverty. Until before the pandemic, Chile had made extraordinary progress in economic growth, infrastructure, and poverty reduction in monetary terms, but not only that. For more than a decade, the paradigm shift began to understand poverty as a complex and multidimensional phenomenon, which implies low income, low human development, and social exclusion. Many of these principles are also framed in the fulfillment of the goals of the 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development with human rights approach. When approaching it from this perspective, it was essential to understand that these conditions affect different groups of the population in a different way according to their ethnicity, age, place of residence, or gender identity, among other dimensions. Without addressing these differences, the complex task of eradicating poverty and making people feel that they lead a life with dignity becomes even more difficult. For this reason, it has been the utmost importance to develop tools that allow evaluating, designing, and implementing public policies for this purpose. Our experience indicates that ending poverty is a matter of sustained political will and progressive efforts rather than an automatic progress. Addressing multidimensional poverty requires institutional arrangements, resources, capacity building, and cooperation aimed at a comprehensive social development policies, which are added to social protection floors that welcome all people, especially considering vulnerable groups that suffer multiple and interrelated forms of discrimination. Also essential in this scheme is the participation of the civil society, which has collaborated in deepening the dimensions of our programs in education, health, work, social security, housing, and social cohesion, among other matters. In this regard, one of the most relevant institutional advances in Chile is the 2012 Anti-Discrimination Law, a milestone that recognized that right not to be arbitrarily discriminated and establishes a judicial procedure to address acts of arbitrary discrimination for reasons such as socioeconomic condition, race, ethnicity, or nationality, among others. Aforementioned law is joined by a network of social protection policies to overcome poverty, with which social protection floors and access to benefits are ensured in the most vulnerable population. The Chilean social protection system considers programs such as Chile Crece Contigo, which comprehensively accompanies, protects, and supports all children and their families, especially in conditions of vulnerability up to 9 years of age, ensuring universal prenatal care, birth assistance, access to health, education, and general welfare services for minors. Another program, Chile Cuida, which focuses on comprehensive care for dependent people, their caregivers, and their families. A third program that we could mention is Elige Vivir Sano, that promotes healthy habits to improve people's quality of life and well-being. A fourth example, Chile Seguridades y Oportunidades, the state main monetary transfer mechanism for family and vulnerable groups, which supplements the autonomous income of households that have enrolled in the program, establishing, for example, an ethical family income, aid for people in street situation, and support for children and adolescents, among others. This last program was fundamental in the efficiency of the distribution of economic aid in Chile during the pandemic COVID-19, which, as in the rest of the world, has shown the fragility of the social protection networks. Chile's efforts to strengthen inclusion are also key to success of the national vaccination plan against COVID-19, which has allowed 89% of the population to have their complete vaccination schedule, and 67 have received at least the third booster dose. The voluntary and free program considers all people, regardless of their social, migratory, or other status. COVID-19 health emergency also considers special measures for homeless population, approximately 50,000 people, who were identified as a priority population for care as a result of exposure to very high health risk. Measures were also adopted to protect the health of indigenous population to reduce the chances of increasing contagions. Support measures were adopted for the most vulnerable indigenous family, such as the provision of food boxes and sanitary items, as well as monetary aid and subsidies. Nevertheless, there is still work to be done to achieve dignity and equality. One of these lessons has been made it possible to conduct the social crisis of 2019 is to open up spaces for political representation, especially exemplified in the process of drafting a new constitution in Chile. The Constituent Convention, democratically elected for this task, has the participation of representatives of social movements, seats reserved for indigenous people, and respecting gender parity among its members. We know that there is still a lot of work to advance in dignity and equality in multidisciplinary terms, and that is why our effort have focuses on improving people's quality of life, increasing social and political inclusion, expanding the possibility of sustainable development of our population. In summary, dear friends, as was said before, poverty is not only something that is reduced to the financial terms. You have to consider very important elements, for example, education, that will help you, inclusion, also you have to, the change of stereotypes and all those things that are very important. And so we feel that this is a multidisciplinary problem that has to be tackled in the same way. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ambassador. I think your presentation really highlighted also the importance of political will and then the comprehensive social programs needed to address the multi-dimensional nature of poverty discrimination. And I was very pleased as well that you highlighted the participatory process for the drafting of the new Chilean constitution, which the world is watching very closely, and we very much hope to see included there poverty or social disadvantage as a ground of discrimination. So thank you, Ambassador, for your presentation. So next we transition. We have some time now for the Q&A, and we've been collecting some questions on the chat. Thanks very much for them. And the first question that has come through is actually for Andrew and Gavin, thanking them very much for their beautiful poetry and imagery, but also asking you, Andrew and Gavin, if you can speak a bit more about why exactly you felt discriminated against during lockdown. What was it about the lockdown experience that made you feel excluded and marginalized? So if you could please answer that question for us. Thanks.
Hi, yeah, I just answered that question in the chat. So Gavin has another example. So
Yeah.
I'd like Gavin to speak.
My example of from when the pandemic first hit Ireland, I was actually employed and I was a security officer. And leading up to the pandemic, I started to get some mental health issues, and I wasn't I wasn't called out for the job, so the job ended up letting me go and things like that. And then I sort of spiraled out of control, the mental health, and then I ended up in. Oh, sorry for talking too fast. I ended up in the homeless services. I was there in homeless services for 12 months, and what I wanted to say is like how damaging that the Dublin City Council homeless services, they're classed as hostels. I had to be in there with all types of drug users. And like I don't discriminate against anybody, so I'm just saying like the type of people who are in these accommodations were openly active drug users and people drinking in the rooms. I had to be sleeping in the room at night with four strange men that I never even seen before in my life, and then like I was afraid of. I was also I got like I was also beat up there, and I had my stuff taken off me and things like that, and then they changed it, so I was kept on changing and changing and changing, but finally I ended up getting a hot property, and me coming out of the lockdown, the COVID, and things like that. I actually had to take a case against my landlord because it was a sub-zero standard accommodation that I was placed into, and therefore that I actually had to take a case to the RTB, which is the Residential Tenancies Board. So they're the court in Ireland who are sanctioned to deal with to deal with landlords. So I recently, Dan can even explain that. I recently took a case to the RTB, and I had 79 pages of evidence against the landlord, and I won my case. And through me winning my case, through me winning my case, that's going to help all the other homeless service users that aren't educated in it the way I am, and I'm going to do my own campaign to support and help and give guidelines as how to tackle these corrupt landlords. And this is going to be another project that I'm going to start up within ATD with the likes of Andrew, Dan, and a few others. You know, so like we're speaking on behalf of the whole Dublin here. You know. And so thank you for giving me the time to talk, and thanks.
I'll just read out the answer that I gave there. So at the start of this pandemic, I started to experience panic attacks while I was in work. It turned out I was suffering from my mental health. I took time off work to get treated. I went into this hospital and I wasn't allowed any visitors, but it was messing with my head. So I took time off work to get treated and end up losing my job just because of what I was going through. Now I feel that was discrimination at the highest order. So let me know what you think.
Great, thanks so much, Andrew and Gavin. And then there is a question that I'm going to ask Guba Wasiani if he could maybe speak to. There's a question about, states, member states of the United Nations making many laws and policies which look good on paper, but the problem then often comes with the implementation. And if you could speak from your experience in your work in Burkina Faso, you know, of the problems of this and how you've tried to overcome this problem of the laws that are meant to benefit poor people not actually being implemented. So please go ahead.
Voilà, merci beaucoup. Les lois qui sont votées, qui sont prises au Burkina Faso, ça doit impliquer ceux qui sont, tout le monde, ça veut dire ceux qui vivent dans la misère. Voilà. Donc, ça veut dire les lois que le gouvernement prend, il ne prend pas compte à la population, il ne prend pas compte à ceux qui souffrent. Il prend des décisions à leur faveur parce qu'ils ont le pouvoir, ils ont les moyens. Tout est facile avec eux. Alors qu'il y a des gens qui n'arrivent pas à se nourrir. Ça, c'est un problème. C'est un problème qu'il faut voir. Pour le développement d'un pays, on a besoin de l'implication de tout le monde. On a besoin de choses. Tout le monde doit mettre la main dans la pâte. Voilà, merci.
Thanks very much, Mr. Wasiani. I think what I really appreciated of what you said was I think you also emphasized this importance of solidarity amongst the poor and standing together, you know, to combat poverty. So thank you for your contribution. The next set of questions I could ask maybe Olivier de Schutter or Dion to answer. And these revolve around essentially the models of discrimination that are most suited to combating poverty. You know, we spoke about direct and indirect discrimination, affirmative action, and then also the question, you know, that poverty often also intersects with other grounds of discrimination, whether on grounds of race or gender, disability, and how should this intersectional discrimination really to be taken into account so that we don't just see poverty as an add-on ground, but it's a ground that acts often in combination with these other grounds. So Olivia, I'll give you the floor first and then maybe ask Dion if she has some contributions.
Thank you, Sandy. I think what I would like to say is that in human rights law, we very often have been focusing on horizontal inequalities based on sex, race, ethnic origin, language, religion, and so on. And very often we have relegated the question of vertical inequalities to social policies. And we indeed have built in more and more states social protection floors and a welfare system that is meant to address the situation of people in poverty and reduce inequalities. But we have not sufficiently taken into account the potential that anti-discrimination law may provide to combat poverty. Now, this is not to say that poverty is just a matter of non-discrimination against people in poverty. And it was very, I think, useful that Ambassador Frank Tessler, for example, not only mentioned the 2012 law against discrimination that Chile has that prohibits discrimination inter alia on grounds of social economic disadvantage, but then went on to mention the various social programs that Chile had put in place in order to combat poverty. I think anti-discrimination is a useful tool, but is certainly not sufficient to eradicate poverty. But it is useful, and it is important to take seriously this additional ground of non-discrimination, in addition to the more classically invoked grounds that we're all familiar with, because povertyism, stereotypes against people in poverty, prejudice against people in poverty are realities that people experience in their daily lives. If you ask people in poverty to speak about their experience, they will tell you about loss of income, about the lack of decent jobs. They will tell you about material deprivation, but they will also tell you about social and institutional maltreatment, discrimination, disempowerment. And so we need to see this as one important component of the fight against poverty, although it is not, of course, a substitute for redistributive policies and for the tools that the welfare state has developed. As regards the models of discrimination or non-discrimination that we can use, I think my intervention tried to address that question, but I'm sure Diane Roman shall have more to add on that particular issue. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Olivia. Diane, and perhaps when you're speaking, you could also just answer to the question of, has there ever been a case in France where someone was found to have violated the prohibition on discrimination on grounds of poverty? So please, Diane, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, because some comments say that I'm being a little bit pessimistic, and of course I'm not. I'm very optimistic. But well, the main difficulty regarding to the French law is that there has been no implementation. I mean, there has been no trials and even less conviction or findings of violations. So in my view, the most important thing now is for us to implement this law and to make it known and to make it alive. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Diane. Another question which came up, which I think, was posed particularly to you, Olivier, but Ambassador Tresler, I think, could also speak about this, is the example where poor people's access to social benefits is often made dependent on a lot of paperwork, and, sort of this becomes a barrier to them accessing benefits, or it's electronic and they don't have access to a computer or the internet, and this then acts as another layer of discrimination. And I just wondered, Olivia, in your work as Special Rapporteur, if you've encountered this, and Ambassador in Chile, is this something that's also been looked at by your government to simplify the processes, not to assume that poor people are trying to defraud the system of social benefits? So perhaps I'll turn to you first, Ambassador, and then to Olivier.
Sorry, I didn't get. I'll try to say a little bit. It's very important, the access to the benefits of, especially of poor people that don't have access. In Chile, you have to make a distinction about the big cities, where we can say there's access through internet. Almost everybody in Chile, the rate of for example, smartphones are very high. Everybody has, even in the lowest income population. They all have a cell phone. What they've been trying to work, and that's true, especially in our legal culture, is simplify the process, make it more comprehensive to everybody. In that sense, there's a program called Ventanilla Única. There's one window only, where you can, in a way, have access to the benefits only through one only portal. So that's something very that has helped a lot. Now the task, I think, it's in rural areas, and especially also one other area that is important. It's the migration. Chile has had in the last couple of years, 10 years, a high influx of migrants that are coming from especially Venezuela. They come in very difficult situation. A lot of them through illegal, in illegal situation. So the task and the priority of the government is to make the access to them to the services. In Chile they have access to education for the children, to health, but sometimes they don't know that. And they don't know where to go. So that's very important. The flow of information, the simplification of the processes. I think those areas are important to work. Thank you, Sandy.
Thanks, Ambassador. And we are running a bit short of time now, but Olivia, I'm going to ask you to give some concluding reflections and also the question then, on where to for this project at UN level in your work to prohibit poverty as a ground of discrimination. So please, and if you can keep it fairly brief.
Thank you, Sandy. I think it's really welcome that we ask also this question of non-take-up of rights, non-access to benefits, and that we treat this as an instance of indirect discrimination, as Bruno Tardieu does. Indeed, my two next reports that will be presented in June to the Human Rights Council will be on, respectively, non-take-up of rights and non-discrimination on grounds of poverty, and I think the two are very closely intertwined. One of the major reasons why people do not claim the benefits they normally should have a right to obtain is because of stigmatization. The fear of being stigmatized is because of shame, and that is a result of a discourse about poverty that blames poverty on people in poverty themselves, that makes them responsible for their own situation. To avoid this and to avoid other instances of non-take-up of rights, we need, when we design public policies, to assess proactively, preventively, what obstacles people in poverty may face. For example, poor access to internet, or the lack of registration in social registries, or the lack of documentation. And we need to do this by involving people in poverty themselves, because they, better than anyone else, understand what obstacles they may face. And we would save many resources and lots of time and energy by ensuring participation from the start, from the design of the programs to the implementation and assessment of the programs, if we involve people in poverty in these different stages. So I think non-discrimination is very closely intertwined with the question of non-take-up of rights, and indeed, those will be the topics of my next report to the UN Human Rights Council at its next session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Olivia. And it's very encouraging to see this work continuing at the international level. But I think, of course, the real work happens at national levels. And, I could just also mention from the South African experience, we also have cases which are going forward. We have legislation that prohibits discrimination on the grounds of socioeconomic socioeconomic status and disadvantage. And we do have some important cases dealing with, for example, discriminatory access of policing resources to poor communities, or discriminatory sanitation services, which, you know, really affect an intersection on race because of apartheid victims, but also gender, because poor sanitation affects women most harshly, their security and dignity, and so forth. So I think this has been an incredibly important conversation, a very rich conversation, and I think this is an area in which much work needs to be done going forward. So all that then remains for me is to thank very much to the organizers, ATD Fourth World, the Office of the High Commissioner, the NGO Committee on Social Development, for pulling together such an excellent set of panelists and presentations, and particularly the voices from community activists in the country, and for your courage and dignity in speaking forth about your experiences. Thank you very much. And then for all the other panelists, Diane Romar, for Ambassador Tresler, and for Olivia de Scutter, thank you very much for your presentations. And I now declare this side event closed. So goodbye to everyone, and have a pleasant rest of your day or evening or afternoon.